Okay. Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for a lot of people to come in from the waiting room. So give us a second. Okay. Okay. I think we're all here. Okay. So greetings, everyone. Hope you're all doing all right. Welcome to the fourth and I believe the last in this exciting series of conversations around poetry and translation, co-sponsored at George Mason University by Poetry Daily and the Cheuse Center for International Writers. The Cheuse Center celebrates the art of creative writing as a means of international dialogue, education, and understanding. At its core, the center facilitates the exchange of international creative writers and writing in order to help foster the tolerance and empathy a more connected world requires. Matt Davis, the director of the Cheuse Center, is in the house, and you should definitely check out the extraordinary series of events they've been having featuring writers from everywhere. Uh, Poetry Daily is, of course, a famous site that has been around for decades and is now housed at George Mason's MFA program. My colleague, Sally Keith, editorial director of Poetry Daily and a spearhead of the current What Translation Sparks series, is in the house. I think my colleague, Peter Streckfuss, also an editor of Poetry Daily and an important moving force for it since it came to Mason, is in the house. And the fantastic team of graduate assistants and volunteers, including the poets in our MFA program, the team that really makes Poetry Daily happen every day. We're so grateful to you. That team is in the house. And my name is Vivek Narayanan. I also teach in Mason's creative writing program and in the English department, and I welcome you all. Before I go on, could I just ask that as audience members, you make sure to please keep your microphones muted throughout the event to reduce feedback and interruptions. Definitely send in your comments and questions via chat at any point, and we'll gather those together and we'll queue up the questions for the discussion right after the first round of presentations. We're here to listen to poems and pick up the thread from a special series that has been running in Poetry Daily, where they've asked a series of, by my count, 17 poets, I think, so far, to present a poem they've translated, and then a short essay addressing the making of the poem. And I have really been gobsmacked by the poems and also the essays. And I really think they've been illuminating and groundbreaking. I know there are mountains of generic translation theory out there. And I know there are also probably mountains of prescriptive translation theory out there. But I think this series really reminded me that every serious poetry translation is really a unique encounter, which brings its own unique sets of obligations and opportunities among, at the least, the translator, the person of the translator, the body of the translator, and the source poem and source poet. And I think it's the uniqueness of each of those encounters that comes out so beautifully in all these short essays that Poetry Daily has been running. And indeed, in the work of the poets we have with us here today. And I think that if you give these essays and translations a little time, you will come away with an altered sense of the nature of the bond between poetry and translation, or at least I did. Now, we don't really have the time to read out the essays, obviously, or the source poems tonight. So go check them out at poems.com. Go there for one poet's essay and stay for all of them. Tonight, we'll go on for an hour and 15 minutes, a little longer than usual because we have 5 poet translators with us. It's an extraordinary group of people, and I'll get right to them. We'll begin with each poet translator reading their translation and giving just a bit of context. And then when we finished with that round, we'll go into discussion. And I'm going to present the writers to you in the order in which their pieces appeared in Poetry Daily over the past 5 weeks. First up, Raquel Salas Rivera. Raquel Salas Rivera is a Puerto Rican poet, translator, and editor. His honors include being named the 2018-19 Poet Laureate of Philadelphia and receiving the New Voices Award from Puerto Rico's Festival de la Palabra. He is the author of 5 full-length poetry books. His third book, Lo Terciario, The Tertiary, won the Lambda Literary Award for Transgender Poetry and was longlisted for the 2018 National Book Award. His fourth book, While They Sleep, Under the Bed is Another Country, was longlisted for the 2020 PEN America Open Book Award and was a finalist for CLMP's 2020 Firecracker Award. His fifth book, Ex Exis, won the inaugural Ambrosio Prize. Antes que Isla es Volcán, Before Island is Volcano. His sixth book is an imaginative leap into Puerto Rico's decolonial future and is forthcoming from Beacon Press in 2022. He has co-edited 2 anthologies, one bilingual anthology based on a special collection of handmade letterpress broadsides by contemporary Puerto Rican poets, and another, the first anthology of Puerto Rican trans poetry. He holds a PhD in comparative literature and literary theory from the University of Pennsylvania, and writes and teaches in Puerto Rico, where he's joining us from right now. Raquel's translation and essay is on quite the nature of the translation encounter here is one with the poetry of his grandfather, Sotera Rivera Aviles, and amazing poet by the example we see here. Raquel tells us in the essay that part of the objective is to search, is to sense, quote, sense in other languages through other filters, my grandfather's poems, and layer them on top of each other until he feels present. And he speaks of his memories of his grandfather's hauntings and says, if the poems are hauntings, then the translations are hauntings of hauntings. Raquel, welcome.
Hola, hi. Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. I'm going to get right into the poem that I translated so as not to take up too much time. Domingo sin iglesia. Get some ambient sounds from Santurce, Puerto Rico. Domingo sin iglesia. Mi brazo artificial, echado sin reparos sobre un mueble, puede reír igual que un zapato sin rumbos, destruido, tirado a lluvia y noches en el patio de entonces. Comprendo su ironía y he pensado en viejos almanaques, en toallas oscuras, en vapores de incienso, cuando monjas pasan bajo el calor de mi ventana. Y es que mi brazo artificial comprende, tiene ese don supremo de reírse cuando piensa en el cura y las señoras viejas, que alzan su rabia y destrozan púlpitos cuando ven pocos pecadores. Churchless Sunday. My artificial arm carelessly tossed on some couch can laugh like an aimless shoe, destroyed, thrown to nights and rain in what was once my yard. I understand its irony and have thought of old almanacs, of dark towels, of whiffs of incense when nuns pass beneath my sweltry window. You see, my artificial arm understands. It has that supreme ability to laugh when it thinks of the priests and the old women that raise their rage and destroy pulpits if they see too few sinners. And some of the context for this, my grandfather is from Añasco, Puerto Rico. Mayagüez is on the west side of the island. Añasco is a small town next to Mayagüez, which was where the sugar cane was grown on the plantations. And a great deal of my work with his poetry argues that he is a sort of self-translator for his Blackness. He was a light-skinned Black man, ambiguously Black, I'd say, who went into the Navy, lost his arm, which is why there's an artificial arm, and was wounded during the Korean War, and returned as a veteran, and through the GI Bill was able to study and become a writer. So he had a very complicated relationship to writing. And I argue that he self-translates for a more letrado audience of sort of intellectual elite in Puerto Rico, which is much whiter. A great deal of his experiences as a poor Black man in Añasco. And this poem in particular goes to his sort of irreverent stance in relation to the church, which he saw as a very conservative institution, the Catholic Church, tied to power in his town. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Raquel, for that yet another layer that you gave us after your essay. Margaret Noodin received an MFA in creative writing and a PhD in English and linguistics from the University of Minnesota. She is a professor of English and American Indian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she also serves as the Associate Dean of the Humanities and Director of the Electa Quinney Institute for American Indian Education. She's the author of Bawajimo, a dialect of dreams in Anishinaabe language and literature, Weweni, and What the Chickadee Knows, which are both bilingual collections of poetry in Anishinaabe, which she was just explaining to me was a sort of umbrella language for Ojibwe. And her translation goes from two marginal languages, goes across two marginal, from the Irish to the Ojibwe. And it has sonic elements, which we will hear. She talks about how the Ojibwe version was written in also to be sung as the original. And she says, though we do have an English translation on our site, she says the poem moved between two endangered languages first, before the version in the dominant language was created. And what really got me is that as she reminds us, she says the English translation is a reminder of linguistic colonization, and in fact, not just linguistic, but of the immensity of the colonial violence as a whole. And she talks about trying to find a link between Irish and Ojibwe as a decolonial act of reclamation. Margaret.
Thank you, Vivek. I will go ahead and read the poem in Ojibwe, and then I can read it in the English as well. I think maybe that's the best for people to understand, not sure. But you can find all of them in the essay online so that people can hear it, and a link to the song as well. Nui Abazewinge. Nui Abazewinge. Ajina etta. Dago enoemaganak. Minisagaming. Ditabuean. Megwa wasezit. Gawinge anmeasing. Ninga bianong. Nui Abazewinge. Ajina etta. Dago enoemaganak. Bunigisada dendaman. Buni baba mendaman. Buni bodewezian. Buni wanamenazon. Ninga bianong. And if you want to hear the meaning, since we're conducting this in English, I'll read that, but the Irish is beautiful as well. I will find solace, a short while only, among relatives on a sea island, walking the stone beach, morning and evening, when I am not praying in the West. I will find solace, a short while only, among relatives without sorrow, without mind worry, without loneliness, without confusion in the West. And this is a translation of the Margaret Noodin poem, Fui Shukavasa, and it really is echoing the sounds of that poem. And you'll notice that the English translation that I provided is different than all of the other previous English translations of this poem, because what I tried to do was echo the sound of the original Irish in Ojibwe. Then I let the English be second to that, and the English really is a recognition of how these two languages come together. So you can hear in both poems the longing for home, the wanting to return, a sense of place and being as connected to a place. And really the final line in the Irish and the Ojibwe, Thirek Bala and Ninga Bianong, to make those match, I think was where the poem started. The last line of each stanza, thinking about how that Thirek Bala, that longingness you feel toward the western side, the place where the sun sets, the place where our metaphors tell us we go when this life ends and the next begins. It was a challenge to try and echo that sound, not to put it into in English syntax or an English set of syllables, to just move straight from the Irish to the Ojibwe. So it then created a third poem in English that was different than I had grown up reading the original Margaret Noodin, because if you study Irish literature, this is a poet that many, many people would recognize. And I felt that by connecting these two Indigenous languages, it gave me a whole new way to think about it, even in English. Maybe we'll leave it there. I think the essay kind of explains a bit more for folks interested in endangered languages or these two particular cultures.
Thanks a lot, Margaret, and it was really interesting to hear about this idea of the connection, the dialogue between Ojibwe and Irish, also kind of re-illuminating new possibilities in English, and I hope to come back to that in the discussion. Jeffrey Angles lives in Kalamazoo, where he is an associate professor of Japanese and translation at Western Michigan University. He's the author of Writing the Love of Boys, University of Minnesota Press, and the award-winning translator of dozens of Japan's most important authors and poets. It's a fascinating translation that he makes of a poem by Hiromi Ito, which is a strange poem in a sense, and he explains how Ito rebelled against the common assumption that poems should employ elevated, concise language, and she showed that poems which establish a singular, neatly organized poetic voice were not necessarily superior to poems deploying more open, polyvocal, amorphous modes of expression. And then, very fascinatingly, he mentions about how this poem by Ito began when she was in Poland, and she was forced to try and express herself in a very limited English. So, so there's this very intense way that the title, and you mentioned, I should end with this, that the title could mean two things: abuse by meaning, or meaning abuse. Jeffrey.
Thank you for that nice introduction. I'll go ahead and read. I'll just read the English because it's fair. It's a little bit long. The maltreatment of meaning. Can you speak Japanese? No, I cannot speak. Yes, I can speak. Yes, I can speak, but cannot read. Yes, I can speak and read, but cannot write. Yes, I can speak and write, but cannot understand. I was a good child. You were a good child. We were good children. That is good. I was a bad child. You were a bad child. We were bad children. That is bad. To learn a language, you must replace and repeat. I was an ugly child. You were an ugly child. We were ugly children. That is ugly. I am bored. You are bored. We are bored. That is boring. I am hateful. You are hateful. We are hateful. That is hatred. I will eat. You will eat. We will eat. That is a good appetite. I won't eat. You won't eat. We won't eat. That is a bad appetite. I will make meaning. You will make meaning. We will make meaning. That is conveying language. I will use Japanese. You will use Japanese. We will use Japanese. That is Japanese. I want to rip off meaning. You want to rip off meaning. We want to rip off meaning. That is the desire to rip off meaning. I want to show contempt for language as nothing more than raw material. You want to show contempt for language as nothing more than raw material. We want to show contempt for language as nothing more than raw material. That is, language is nothing more than raw material. I will replace words mechanically and make sentences impossible in real life. You will replace words mechanically and make sentences impossible in real life. We will replace words mechanically and make sentences impossible in real life. That is replacing words mechanically and making sentences impossible in real life. Rip off meaning, sound remains. Yet even so, we search for meaning. The primitive reflex of a newborn sucking a finger, one sticks out. The primitive reflex of a newborn sucking a finger, I stick out. The primitive reflex of a newborn sucking a finger, you stick out. The primitive reflex of a newborn sucking a finger, we stick out. The primitive reflex of a newborn sucking a finger, that sticks out. As for me, meaning. As for you, meaning. As for us, meaning is meaning that is, do not communicate. As for me, do not communicate. As for you, do not communicate. As for us, do not communicate. Do not do that. That is communication. Meaning ripped apart and covered in blood is surely miserable. That is happiness. I am happy, meaning covered in blood is miserable. You are happy, meaning covered in blood is miserable. We are happy, meaning covered in blood is miserable. The blood-covered meaning of that is blood-covered misery, and that is happiness. Thanks. I'm very happy to be able to share this this poem by Hiromi Ito. I think it's quite. I quite literally can say that if it wasn't for my encounter with this Japanese writer, I wouldn't be a poet myself today. I think that I grew up a a queer boy in a very conservative family that was quite religious. I think that for much of my life, I didn't feel like I really fit into the language that I saw around me. I felt like I didn't fit into the world that I saw around me. And so, you know, when I was relatively young and just beginning to explore non-English literature, you know, reading in Japanese, I was astounded to find this writer, this radical feminist writer who was rebelling so strongly against the language, who was you know, taking issue with the language. And this poem in particular struck me. This is the one that like, you know, reached out and grabbed me. So that's the one that I wanted to share with you today. And the reason for that was because she, in this poem, she you know, we sense in the initial parts of it, her uncomfortability, you know, existing within language, expressing herself within these kind of neatly defined patterns of language. But over the course of the poem, she slowly rebels against that language. She slowly rebels against those patterns. And so by the end of the poem, those patterns are breaking down and they're conforming to her will rather than her you know, conforming herself to the will of language outside of her. So that kind of attitude towards language was so radical for me, so freeing that I felt like I had to translate it. That was the first thing I ever translated by her, and in some ways that was I think the beginning of my start as a poet. So wanted to share that with you today, and thank you for the opportunity to do so.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for that illuminating performance, and also for you know, for being for showing us you know, the encounter that Ito's rebellion against meaning, and how much meaning that had for you. So Laura Marris is a writer and translator. Her poems and essays have appeared or are forthcoming in the New York Times, The Believer, the Yale Review, the Volta, the Common, and elsewhere. Her work has been supported by a MacDowell Colony Fellowship and a Daniel Varujan Award. Recent translations include Paul Koenig's Tristan with Rosemary Waldrop, Geraldine Schwartz's Those Who Forget, and Louis Guyu's Blood Dark, which was shortlisted for the 2018 Oxford Weidenfeld Translation Prize. She teaches creative writing at the University of Buffalo and is currently at work on a new translation of Albert Camus', wait for it, The Plague. You know, Laura's essay really works out this idea. She mentions how this act of translation, you know, that the poet that she works on, Paul Koenig, his work can be intimate in the way that translation is intimate. But it's a strange, because, you know, if we think of the English translation in a way as a kind of an erasure, what Koenig is grappling with is an earlier erasure, and that of the Breton language. You know, and she mentions that, you know, when he was growing up, Breton was forbidden in French schools. Schools posted signs that read "No spitting on the floor" or "Speaking Breton," and that he once saw a teacher hanging a student out the window by his ankles as a punishment for Breton, for speaking Breton. And so you know, grappling with these kinds of this kind of loss is something I think that she does in a fascinating way, and also in her essay. So Laura.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here and to hear these wonderful translations. So I'm actually going to give you a little bit of context beforehand, and then I am going to read the poem second, if that's all right. And so just to follow up on what Vivek said, Paul Koenig is a poet from Brittany in the western part of France, and his whole life, he's been kind of an advocate for Breton language and culture, and an advocate for Breton independentism and against the erasure of the Breton language, as somebody who is one of the few people in his generation who didn't lose his mother tongue when he was sent to French schools. A lot of other people from his generation did end up losing their Breton when they were sent to school in French. And so because of his politics, he actually ended up being fired from his job as a teacher in Brittany, and ended up coming to live in the US for 35 years. And so the poem that I'm going to read for you tonight has the sense of losing Breton, but then also the sense of kind of returning from an exile to a place that had sustained a lot of ecological damage since he had last lived there. So, you know, a lot of Paul's work is rooted in the specificity of the Breton language and the Breton landscape. And because of the way, you know, economic development had really changed Brittany from a landscape of small family farms to factory farms while he was away, he was dealing with both the kind of linguistic crisis, which was potentially improving, you know, more children are speaking Breton in school now, but the ecological crisis, which was kind of unfolding and happening. So there's a sense that you're kind of returning from exile, but you can't go back. And for me as a translator, Paul's work was so important because his work was really an invitation to think about what you're doing as a translator when you're translating in a place that is very suspicious of linguistic authority because of the history with kind of French repressing Breton, and how to think about cultural humility in translation. And so those things are things that I still think about a lot every time I translate something. And I'm really grateful to Paul's work for kind of raising that question for me. And so I'm just gonna read the poem for you now. So from the Berlin Wall, or blackberry picking in Western Brittany. The great glut of potato bugs is how I think of this garden. Overturned wheelbarrow, lessiveuse. Beneath a structure of flying colors, the laundry line coated in gold. Oh, sweet therapist, from hutch to coop, since the path with a view of the sea, I have a neurosis at heart in times of mass production. Desire devours censure, austerity of yesterday, disparate dreams, which is their specialty. Sorrow commands, it's a bad bargain, it's a tale that begins among flies. Pylons and posts receive the calls, the town embodies the irony. Now they are accomplished prophecies, damned, damned country, tricks the blue sky, tricks death in dreams. Come closer, she says, the little urchin swapped for the excellence of ire and fury. Midway through the cabbages, our shadow grows, a shadow made of cabbages. From care to here, subjecting the path to our channeled words. Minimum of space, angry gestures against an infamous dualism. Walking in spirit through the cabbages doesn't get my feet less wet. I write to soak my feet among the cabbages. Ladybugs of memory, the bounding of lessiveuse, the swallows like affect. Here and there I am affected by what's inert in language. I speak with the backdrop of capitalist deployment, now irresistible. In a country by the sea, taking to the pedals against the wind, you spit out your soul. It hits you right on the mouth.
Thank you, Laura. And I was just, you know, when you were reading, I was just again remembered, you know, kind of brought to the fact of how much pleasure that word lessiveuse brought me when it appeared in your poem. Tracy K. Smith is the author of Wade in the Water, Life on Mars, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, Duende, winner of the James Laughlin Award, and The Body's Question, winner of the Cave Canem Poetry Prize. She's also the editor of an anthology, American Journal, 50 Poems for a Time, and the author of a memoir, Ordinary Light, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. From 2017 to 2019, she was the Poet Laureate of the United States, and she teaches at Princeton University. And there are other things I could add here, but foremost to mind comes the podcast, Slow Down, which I think was really meaningful and sustaining podcast for a lot of people. And Tracy translates through mediation a Chinese poet, Yi Lei, and she asks a lot of fascinating questions in this essay, but she says, talks about how this encounter. She says barriers like age, nationality, language, culture, and race, which ought to have made us less recognizable to one another, instead became vantage points, inviting us to see one another and ourselves anew. And talks about the moment when she realizes that she was also an audible presence there beside the poem's original speaker, harmonizing. And she asks, what might it mean for a reader to be assured that herself, as marked by race or any other signifier of identity, need not submit to being an effaced presence in another poet's lines, need not be a silent witness or mute interloper? Tracy.
Thank you. I'm so honored and delighted to be here, and I love what I'm feeling and hearing. I'll say that I started translating Yi Lei's poems because I met her, and I really feel like I just fell in love with this person that I could know only through mediation. I worked on her poems with a co-translator, but there was something alive in her work that made me feel like filled with awe, and made me also feel like, do I see myself there? Do I see the self that I would like at some point to be in these poems? And working in this triangulated way, me working on a literal English translation and then having that kind of translated back for Yi Lei, and the conversation, the work of coming to recognize and understand one another made me recognize that there's something so beautiful about the distance that a poem or another translated text crosses when it goes from one language to another. But equally exciting, I think, is the distance that we readers or receivers of the text might be made to travel, to realize that we can be changed by this. We can change our understanding of who and what we are. We can assess our assumptions, our wishes, our expectations, and even the sense of tolerance, as opposed to, I don't know, susceptibility to being startled and changed in the work. And I think that's what I take away from this process and from the relationship that I had with Yi Lei in the last years of her life. So I'm going to read the poem Black Hair, which accompanied that essay that Vivek was talking about. And it's a poem that for a Chinese feminist poet who was deeply committed to feelings of independence, of autonomy, political autonomy, an advocate for the planet and the environment, someone who believed in eternity. It's a poem that has a lot to do with power, gender, youth, vulnerability, and the ways that expectations can constrain or confine us, and what we do to get beyond that. As I was working on this poem as a Black woman, it was very hard for me not to hear in the phrase Black hair, which recurs as a refrain throughout the poem, space for my own politics to sit beside or beneath Elai's. And that was a really exciting moment of, of collision or harmonizing, as I talk about it in the essay. So this is Black hair. Black hair, like youth, runs wild in March. Dark papery leaves fly, teeming, swarming, bum rushing March. Black hair in March is gentle, stranger's eyes softer. Memory, a feast on offer. Youth, born of the primordial sea. Embrace me. Drape my skin, old as clouds, in something suppler. Black hair blown free, rootless, wanders the desert's countless tombs, sways across a vacant sky, whips at fresh mud in rain. Days blaze past. I have lost sight of my own black hair in the mirror. Let me watch it now for the next 1,000 years. Black hair, weedy in dirt-poor soil, thirsty, deluded, squandering its spoils. Black hair has no idea. The story of black hair is my story. When I die, let me drift like a dandelion of black hair. Black hair like holy water. No way. There is no way to be saved except to die. When black hair cries, its tears snuff themselves out like candles. So will my life cease to flicker. Black hair, exhausted brush fire, fanned by misery, whistling through the last century. Black hair, shredded black flag of a woman's glory, ragged and battered in March wind, forsaking dignity, absolved of chastity, with its pride in knots, black hair smiles easily in March. If waterfall, it will plummet. If cloud, it will scatter. Eyes plaintive, wide. Black hair waits to be spun by hardened hands into rock. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Yeah. So there we are at the start. I think I will be getting Martin will be sending me any questions that you have. Of course, pop them in the chat, and we'll queue them up. But to start off, if you don't mind, I had a couple of questions, and I think that they could be related. So I'm going to lay them both out, and this is for everyone. But certain things that I was thinking about in reading the translations and essays. Jeffrey, as I mentioned, Hiromi, you talk about how Hiromi Ito wrote the poem in Japanese when she was in Poland and was immensely frustrated, angry with having to express all the thoughts she had in a limited English. And Margaret reminds us, that English translation is a reminder of colonization. And I think you could say it's not the only one, but I think you could say that English has emerged now as the preeminent language of colonization and of white supremacy. And yet, here we are having a conversation in English. That's the reality of it. So there's a theme that seems to actually come up in many of the essays. I mean, the only interesting push against that I think came in Raquel's essay when she talks about how her grandfather, his grandfather would have liked a line, the first line of the translation, of his translation. So, so the question I want to ask is, what do we do about English? And what do we do to English? And how can the act or perhaps the state, the mode of translation help with that? And the second question, which if you don't mind, I'll lay it out, is related. Tracy's essays and I think the others in different ways dismantle for me the established idea of the translator who is unmarked, right? And this is an idea that on one hand, the unmarked translation seems, on one hand, seems like a supremely humble and self-effacing gesture. Don't let me stand in the way of the poem, etc. But on the other hand, I think it also quietly makes the translation and the source synonymous, and singular. And so in a way, almost takes over the poem. The translator becomes the source poet, takes over the body of the source poet. I can't help thinking of it as, the translator as a body snatcher. So how do we move into this other idea of the translator being a marked presence, and of the translator harboring and welcoming the cohabitation of, sorry, that was my mother calling from India. So how do we move into this other idea of the translator being a marked presence, and of the translation harboring and welcoming the cohabitation of multiple presences? Raquel speaks of this explicitly as well in his essay, as I think the word hauntings come up. So let's say at least that that it's a place where you have the source poem and poet, the translator, and the reader being welcomed into the space of translation. So where can this idea take us? So I want to put it to all the panelists, and you can answer either question or perhaps both. What to do with English, and the translation as a welcoming place for multiple presences or multiple hauntings. Anybody who wants to jump in?
I can. Jeffrey, you want to go first?
Oh, well, I have plenty to say, but please go ahead, Raquel.
Yeah, what to do with English? What a great question. I feel I've been grappling with most of my life. I think being in Puerto Rico, being from Puerto Rico, which directly is a colony of the U.S. and has a linguistic relationship that is colonial to the U.S., in which we speak Spanish here, and very few people are bilingual and speak English. It is sort of the question what to do with English. And especially being a Puerto Rican poet that writes in Spanish and self-translates, sort of the difficulty comes from the fact that most of the poets here don't do that sort of self-translation, in part because they don't speak English that fluently. So there's sort of an indebtedness to an entire country full of poets whose work can't exactly circulate in Latin America in many ways because of the Jones Act and because of a variety of things, including the local cultural production industry. And it doesn't circulate in the United States because they don't engage with the Axis language because it's very loaded. And so what to do with English is sort of the question, right? What to do with English. I do find it interesting, right? Sort of what you're kind of presenting in the question is English is an Axis language that has a very sort of neoliberal imperial presence all over the world. And it's, even more embodied, I think, for people from US colonies that have that contentious relationship with it. I don't have a clear answer. All I can say is that I try as best I can to make evident my presence as a translator when I translate, precisely for that reason, both where I'm from and what I'm in dialogue with. And probably why I chose to translate my grandfather before I delved into anyone else. Because I feel that I have a lot of checks and balances with my own family where I can't just do whatever I want with the translation. I sort of owe something to them. And I can't just make up whatever I want with his life story. So I feel that keeps me in check in a way that I like as a translator.
I love that answer. I feel that, you know, when you talk about the complicated relationship to language that is characteristic to English, that's characteristic of Puerto Rican relationship to language, I'm also thinking there are many English speakers who also embody that, a different complicated relationship to the language. And so much of the work of poets to wrestle with that and to make space within, you know, the official language for all of the many other lives and forms that it has, that seems like a really exciting project. And what excites me is to imagine those imaginations and vocabularies and struggles and complications also doing the work of translation, so that what we eliminate from our imagination is the figure that made me feel like I shouldn't be trying to translate poetry from Chinese, which is the definitive translation, you know, the white male translator who is a quote unquote invisible present, but whose biases and assumptions and ego are actually, you know, manifest within the act. And I love the idea that bringing more of those dynamics into the project of translation would make us aware of the illusion of neutrality.
Yeah, just to follow up on that comment, which I think is really beautifully put. I think so many of us are, you know, we think about the language that a poem or a text ends up in as kind of, you know, the definitive language of that. You know, it's kind of when we talk about, you know, the dominance of English and the kind of post-colonial implications of that. But I think, you know, what Tracy said is so beautiful, and what Raquel said as well, because the context that these poems emerge out of, the originals, you know, they're very multilingual contexts, and we're actually hearing so many more languages than we always acknowledge on a daily basis. And so, you know, to the question in the chat, for example, like in Paul's case, he often will write a poem in French that has some Breton in it and that has some English in it. But the poem kind of reflects the linguistic language and all the layers, the layers of the linguistic landscape that he's moving through on a daily basis. So I think that kind of acknowledging that multilingual context is super important when we're translating, and to try to kind of preserve as much of that multilingual context as we can, even when we bring a text into English.
That's a really nice point. I was reminded of the writing of Antoine Bergman, you know, who talks about the deforming tendencies that tend to happen when a text is translated from one language into another. And so Bergman points out that he lists the various kinds of deformations that tend to happen in translation, and one of them is the effacement of the superimposition of language in the original. That language, you know, that feels different, that's grainy, that's not necessarily smooth, you know, tends to get flattened out and ironed out in the process of translation. So I like the fact that you mentioned that. I have so many thoughts here. One of the questions earlier about what do we do with English? Yeah, I was just reminded of this. You know, very often. You know, Japanese is the other language that I work in, and it's very interesting, you know, interacting with Japanese poets, because there is so much desire to be translated into English, and English in particular, because English is the gateway to be read around the world. Very often English translations are then translated in what's called juyaku in English, Japanese, a translation on top of another translation. The English is translated into another language. And English is the language that gets you invited to international poetry festivals and international events and so on. And so for poets wanting to leave to leave Japan and participate in the world, English is really necessary. And so this kind of neo-colonial attitude of English, I think, is really problematic. I mean, looking at it kind of from the outside, well, of course I understand it, and it's important for translation is important for Japanese writers to be able to join and communicate with the world. There is this kind of power imbalance that exists. So what to do with English? When I was living in Japan, and so at the time it felt very natural to start writing in Japanese. And so actually, I mean, most of my own original writing has been in Japanese so far. And much to my surprise, it got a lot of critical attention, and I think people were kind of astounded that a person who kind of looks like this was living in Japan and writing poetry in Japanese. But I mean, I think that there's all kinds of interesting things that we can do as these people who sort of exist in the kind of transitional spaces between languages, close to the various borderlands that run across us and run across our languages. I think there are all interesting interventions that we can make that that perhaps monolingual people aren't able to do. So I think that can be a really valuable part of poetic practice.
Margaret, did you want to say something?
I would just agree with what's been said. I mean, I think that the way that we do the translation and the way that we think about languages that have colonized a space, we have an opportunity using those languages to resituate them. So I know many people who have no access to their indigenous language anymore, and they have to write in the language of the colonizer, so to speak. But what they do is they make it their own, and they're able to find the way to bring their style and their aesthetic into that space using the tools that they have, the tools that came to them. It's not really a choice for many people to move back to the heritage language, so they use English. And we might want to privilege our original language, the heritage language, but because so many people have a lot of, I think, trauma and a lot of concern about making that more precious, when English is the only thing some people have, I think we have to be really cautious when we do work between those spaces. Not an easy answer, I guess.
Thank you. I mean, did anybody want to speak any more to this, the question of multiple presences and the translation as a space of multiple presences?
I can say something that ties it a little bit to the previous question, which is just an example from one of Powell's lines. There's actually a Breton word in the poem that I read. The line "from care to here," K-E-R, is a Breton word that means home, but it also means like a small village or a community, a place where people gather. But something that I think is really relevant to the idea of multiple presences is that because Powell has lived in Brittany and he's had to deal with French, and then he spent so much time in America, like he will often pick a Breton word that can kind of come through French and make a sound in English that also reminds us of a word in English. So in English, care sounds like our word for care. So there's this kind of full circle of all the like linguistic presences in that line and the meanings that they thread. It's sort of like threading the eye of a needle with all the possible connotations in Breton, in French, and then in English. So I think that's one way, you know, we can think about hauntings of hauntings, which is such a beautiful idea.
I just wanted to add something, I think, because I feel similarly to the way that oftentimes poetry is spoken about as if it, without mentioning silence, right? That there's always the option not to translate. And I want to acknowledge that so many poets here choose that, not just because they don't speak English, but because they don't want to translate. And that, well, of course, we're translators here, right? So of course, we're going to talk about translation and the importance of translation. But I do want to say that that is a political option for a lot of people, and that coexists in a world where there are translations into English.
That's a great, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I would just say that I would add to that we often think of translation as moving between, and I know people talk about, you know, people living in two worlds, going from one space to another, but that's a very binary kind of view. And I think it's almost like living in a house with many windows. Instead of saying that you're always in one space and then you move into the other one, I think actually all of us, when we're doing translation, it's the act of being in both, of being in both spaces at one time, trying to bring them together. I have so many students that they bring to my classroom multicultural identities, and they can't be less Black or less Oneida. You know, they can't switch one on and one off, and they're always seeing the world in a way that makes sense to them, bringing both together. So I think I see translation as that same opportunity to really try and view things through really two windows at one time, maybe, or live in a house with more than one window.
That's a really nice metaphor. I'm always fascinated with the particular metaphors that people use to describe translation. Ito, the writer who I shared with you tonight, she comes from an interesting background. Her grandmother was a shamaness and would speak to the gods in order to help people, you know, when they needed advice. And she really claims that as a part of her heritage and a part of her kind of poetic inspiration. She embraces that metaphor of poet as shaman all the time. But, you know, when I was speaking with her once, you know, she pointed out, she said, well, you know, the poet as shaman metaphor, you know, is beautiful for translation as well. You are possessed by the original. The original works its way into you. It descends into you from someplace above, you know, and then works through your body. It takes over your body and then works through your voice. So there's a kind of, you know, multiplicity, you know, that's implicit in there. That it's potentially the translator's voice, the translator's body, the translator's hands, you know, that's typing, but at the same time, it's another kind of spirit, you know, working through them as well. I really like that metaphor, and I think that it's incredibly apt.
I would love to say something, but I've already spoken a lot, so maybe someone else can
Please do say something.
I was just thinking about that idea of the house with the windows open, right? And I was thinking about how each of us translates and is translating, right, in so many ways as a tool for the context that we're in, right? And I was thinking, what would that house be like where I am right now with my students that speak Spanish and don't speak English? And I think it's more like a house where they have to shut all the doors because people are coming in and neo-colonizers are coming in and announcing that they're moving here and they're buying up the houses that people were forced to leave to go to the diaspora because of the hurricane, because they didn't have the resources and can't come back to. And they're buying up this land, right? These multimillionaires that want tax exemptions. And so I think people feel a little bit like they need to close those windows and those doors. And I think so often, right, about how translators are in dialogue with their contexts and how often our translations are speaking to someone we have in mind, right? And that in a way, it's what makes a metaphor so potent as it moves context, right? And how it makes that analogy change a little bit in a different space.
Raquel, there was also, there was a great point that you made earlier, and someone echoed it in the chat about, how the silences are important too, and that in fact, in addition to translation, there's also the choice to refuse to translate, and that even in the course of a translation can contain many refusals, and that becomes part of the system. Okay, I'm not sure I'm keeping track of all the. Okay, we have 10 minutes left to go. Well, there was a question from. I'm sorry, I can't read the name very easily in the window, but there's a question about. It's a question for Tracy K. Smith, but I think could be posed to all of you, which is. She says, after learning my heritage and history, I'm interested in translating my direct ancestors. As a scholar, as a poet, and as a Black woman, I wonder if this is something you two have struggled with, and what advice you have for a second-year MFA candidate working in translation. And so, what kinds of things should people be thinking about as working poets moving into the question of translation, given an era where you can no longer have the luxury of being unmarked?
I keep thinking about Raquel's comment about the haunting, translating his grandfather's work and the double layers of that. And I feel like that's so productive. I mean, that the discomfort and the wish that live within that condition feels incredibly productive to the question of, I want to work on the voices of my own ancestors. I feel like that's a really fruitful starting point. I don't think there is a way that the voices of my ancestors should arrive to any reader without haunting or troubling them in some way, even with a message of hope, resilience, survival. All of that should also create a sense of fear, humility, I must change my life feeling. And so I feel like the discomfort of even entering the project is a productive feeling. I don't know if I'm tackling enough of the question, but maybe others have perspectives on some of the other layers of the question.
Anyone?
I could add one thing. I mean, listening to that description about the voices of ancestors. So a couple of times in poems, I've tried to address the idea that our term for ancestor is anakobijigan, which is one who is connected. And in some ways, translating those ideas and thinking about what an ancestor is and how we build those connections and maintain them, I think is part of it as well. So the comment about what it means to move that ancestor's voice forward, and does it need to do some troubling, I think is a really good question, because there are histories that should not be forgotten. There are ways of viewing the world that I think can go unnoticed if we don't take time to translate them forward. So I like that question that is brought up, what should happen when we go back and we hear those voices? What do they need to move forward?
I want to just say one other thing. It's not quite an active translation, but there's a poem in my most recent book that is archival in nature, and it draws voices of African-American soldiers, veterans of the Civil War, and their descendants. I initially was going through this material because I thought I would absorb and learn and metabolize this information and write a poem in my voice. But I found myself in the presence of voices that had not finished the work that they had set out to do. They were alive, warm, active. And I felt it was my job really to just gather and curate and let other people or invite other people to listen. But what I noticed was all of this amazing poetry that was alive in letters to the president, letters to the government, the urgency of these appeals for information, for fair treatment and other things. And that feels like a situation where a translator's touch should be so light, should really allow the, I don't know, the terrible agency of this work, the urgent, fervent kind of intention to be the loudest thing, even in, you know, places where things are not transparent, even in places where things are under so much strain that part of what they're saying is technically wrong. Like somehow doing that kind of transmission feels like an interesting balancing act, I guess, between bringing it through one's own voice and one's own conviction, and also trusting that these voices are alive and present. And, you know, almost like Jeffrey was saying, if we position ourselves properly, we can receive them on their own in a way.
I have a question for you, Tracy, because it's such a generative answer. And I also, reading your book, thought of those moments, those poems in particular, right in the middle section, as sorts of translations of sorts. And I was wondering if poems that engage in a more direct and contestatory way, for example, I think of certain erasures of state documents, right, or sort of like violent, sort of state violence, can be seen as translations that have a different sort of role for the translator, because you describe the translator as ideally one that's, you know, sort of allowing voices to come through. And I wonder if you thought it was possible for there to be sort of contestatory translators that play a more violent role with relation to documents that are in them and of themselves violent. I don't know if that makes sense, but
I love that question. I think yes. And part of the, like, so now I start wanting to lean into this other vocabulary of, I really believe I am listening to something outside of myself in any act of, you know, like poetry. But in erasures, my experience of wanting to find the countercurrent in some of these, you know, like federal papers, I believe it's really about listening to a living voice that is actually telling the truth within documents which are designed to do the opposite. I have so much faith that language is a living thing, and that our presence and our will and our handprint on what we say is so present that even our lies have a voice if we listen in the right way. And I think that's just a really interesting wish to bring to the act of something like a found poem or an erasure poem.
We have just about a minute or two if anybody wants to add something. As usual, just when things get going, it's time to go. But anybody want to add something?
This is just so almost like obvious that maybe I shouldn't, maybe I'm wasting people's time by saying it, but for the second year MFA candidate who's working in translation, I just want to say, like, be bold. There's so much work to be done. Like, I was crunching some numbers a while back, and I figured out that on average, there are 4 books per year translated from Japanese into English of poetry. 4. That's a tiny number. So what that means is that one single dedicated MFA student can make a gigantic difference in what the world knows of Japanese poetry, for instance. You know, one person can make a really significant intervention, and that's incredibly exciting. That's I think it's easy sometimes, especially when starting off in translation, to get a little bit lost in, you know, oh, what do I do? And rejection notices. Oh, you know, oh, my work isn't worth anything. But be bold, and because I think, you know, even one person can make an enormous difference.
That's great advice. Be bold. And we're out of time. But I just wanted to maybe end with Jennifer Grotz brings up Milvosh, a quote from Milvosh, and I won't get into the house metaphor because we've already explored that. But he's, just to say that he says that the purpose of poetry is to remind us how difficult it is to remain just one person. Thank you. It's really been really nice being here with all of you, and hope to see you again.